Chapter 13. How I Fell in with the Curate. After given this sudden lesson in the power of terrestrial weapons, the Martians retreated to their original position upon Horsell Common, and in their haste and encumbered with the debris of their smashed companion, they no doubt overlooked many such a stray and unnecessary victim as myself. Had they left their comrade and pushed on forthwith, there was nothing at that time between them and London but batteries of 12-pounder guns, and they would certainly have reached the capital in advance of their tidings of their approach. As sudden, dreadful, and destructive their advent would have been as the earthquake that destroyed Lisbon a century ago. But they were in no hurry. Cylinder followed cylinder in its interplanetary flight, and 24 hours brought them reinforcements. And meanwhile, the military and naval authorities, now fully alive to the tremendous power of their antagonists, worked with furious energy, until, before twilight, every copse, every row of suburban villas on the hilly slopes about Kingston and Richmond masked an expectant black muzzle, and through the charred and desolate area, perhaps 20 square miles altogether, that encircled the Martian encampment on Horsell Common, through charred and ruined villages among the green trees, through the blackened and smoking arcades that had been but a day ago pine spinneys, crawled the devoted scouts with the heliographs that were presently to warn the gunners of the Martian approach. But the Martians now understood our command of artillery and the danger of human proximity, and not a man ventured within a mile of either cylinder, save at the price of his life. It would seem these giants spent the earlier part of the afternoon going to and fro, transferring everything from the second and third cylinders, the second in Addlestone Golf Links and the third in Pierford, to their original pit on Horsell Common. Over that, above the blackened heather and ruined buildings that stretched far and wide, stood one as sentinel, while the rest abandoned their vast fighting machines and descended into the pit. They were hard at work there far into the night, and the towering pillar of dense green smoke that rose therefrom could be seen from the hills above Merrow, and even, it is said, from Bandstand and Epsom Downs. And while the Martians behind me were thus preparing for their next sally, and in front of me humanity gathered for the battle, I made my way, with infinite pains and labour, from the fire and smoke of burning Weybridge towards London. I saw an abandoned boat, very small and remote, drifting downstream, and, throwing off the most of my sodden clothes, I went after it, gained it, and so escaped out of that destruction. There were no oars in the boat, but I contrived to paddle as much as my parboiled hands would allow, down the river towards Halliford and Walton, going very tediously and continually looking behind me, as you may well understand. I followed the river because I considered the water gave me my best chance of escape should these giants return. The hot water from the Martians' overthrow drifted downstream with me, so that for the better part of a mile I could see little of either bank. Once, however, I made out a string of black figures hurrying across the meadows from the direction of Weybridge. Halliford, it seemed, was quite deserted, and several of the houses facing the river were on fire. It was strange to see the place quite tranquil, quite desolate under the hot blue sky, with the smoke and little threads of flame going straight up into the heat of the afternoon. Never before had I seen houses burning without the accompaniment of an inconvenient crowd. A little further on, the dry reeds up the bank were smoking and glowing, and a line of fire inland was marching steadily across the late field of hay. For a time I drifted, so painful and weary was I after the violence I had been through, and so intense the heat upon the water. Then my fears got the better of me again, and I resumed my paddling. The sun scorched my bare back. At last, the bridge at Walton was coming into sight round the bend. My fever and faintness overcame my fears, and I landed on the Middlesex bank and lay down, deadly sick, amidst the long grass. I suppose the time was about 4 or 5 o'clock. I got up presently, walked perhaps a mile without meeting a soul, and then lay down again in the shadow of a hedge. I seem to remember talking wonderingly to myself during that last spurt. I was also very thirsty and bitterly regretful I had drunk no more water. It was a curious thing that I felt angry with my wife. I cannot account for it, but my impotent desire to reach Leatherhead worried me excessively. I do not clearly remember the arrival of the curate, so that I probably dozed. I became aware of him as a seated figure in soot-smudged shirt sleeves and with his upturned clean-shaven face staring at a faint flickering that danced over the sky. The sky was what is called a mackerel sky, rows and rows of faint down plumes of cloud just tinted with the midsummer sunset. I sat up, and at the rustle of my motion he looked at me quickly. "Have you any water?" I asked abruptly. He shook his head. "You've been asking for water for the last hour," he said. For a moment we were silent, taking stock of one another. I dare say he found me a strange enough figure, naked save for my water-soaked trousers and socks, scalded, and my face and shoulders blackened from the smoke. His face was a fair weakness, his chin retreated, and his hair lay in crisp, almost flaxen curls on his low forehead. His eyes were rather large, pale blue, and blankly staring. He spoke abruptly, looking vacantly away from me. "What does it mean?" he said. "What do these things mean?" I stared at him and made no answer. He extended a thin white hand and spoke in almost a complaining tone. "Why are these things permitted? What sins have we done? The morning service was over. I was walking through the roads to clear my brain for the afternoon, and then fire, earthquake, death, as if it was Sodom and Gomorrah. All our work undone, all the work. What are these Martians?" "What are we?" I answered, clearing my throat. He gripped his knees and turned to look at me again. For half a minute, perhaps, he stared silently. "I was walking through the roads to clear my brains," he said, "and suddenly fire, earthquake, death." He relapsed into silence, with his chin now sunken almost to his knees. Presently he began waving his hand. "All the work, all the Sunday schools, what have we done? What has Weybridge done? Everything gone, everything destroyed. The church, we rebuilt it only 3 years ago, gone, swept out of existence. Why?" Another pause, and he broke out again like one demented. "The smoke of her burning goeth up for ever and ever," he shouted. His eyes flamed, and he pointed a lean finger in the direction of Weybridge. By this time I was beginning to take his measure. The tremendous tragedy in which he had been involved, it was evident that he was a fugitive from Weybridge, had driven him to the very verge of his reason. "Are we far from Sunbury?" I said in a matter-of-fact tone. "What are we to do?" he asked. "Are those creatures everywhere? Has the earth been given over to them? Are we far from Sunbury? Only this morning I officiated an early celebration. Things have changed," I said quietly. "You must keep your head. There is still hope." "Hope?" "Yes, plentiful hope for all this destruction." I began to explain my view of our position. He listened at first, but as I went on, the interest in his eyes changed to the former stare, and his regard wandered from me. "This must be the beginning of the end," he said, interrupting me. "The end, the great and terrible day of the Lord, when men shall call upon the mountains and the rocks to fall upon them and hide them from the face of him that sitteth upon the throne." I began to understand the position. I ceased my labored reasoning, struggled to my feet, and standing over him, laid my hand on his shoulder. "Be a man," said I. "You are scared out of your wits. What good is religion if it collapses at calamity? Think of what earthquakes and floods, wars and volcanoes have done before to men. Did you think God had exempted Weybridge? He is not an insurance agent, man." For a time he sat in blank silence. "But how can we escape?" he asked suddenly. "They are invulnerable, they are pitiless." "Neither the one nor perhaps the other," I answered. "And the mightier they are, the more sane and wary should we be. One of them was killed yonder not 3 hours ago." "Killed?" he said, staring about him. "How can God's ministers be killed?" "I saw it happen," I proceeded to tell him. "We have chanced to come in for the thick of it," said I, "and that is all." "What is that flicker in the sky?" he asked abruptly. I told him it was the heliograph signaling, that it was the sign of human help and effort in the sky. "We are in the midst of it," I said. "Quiet as it is, that flicker in the sky tells of the gathering storm. Yonder, I take it, are the Martians, and Londonward, where those hills rise above Richmond and Kingston, and the trees give cover, earthworks are being thrown up and guns are being laid. Presently the Martians will be coming this way again." And even as I spoke, he sprang to his feet and stopped me by a gesture. "Listen," he said. From beyond the low hills across the water came the dull resonance of distant guns and a remote, weird crying. Then everything was still. A Maybug came droning over the hedge and past us. High in the west, the crescent moon hung faint and pale above the smoke of Weybridge and Shepperton and the hot, still splendour of the sunset. We had better follow this path, I said, northward. Chapter 14. In London. My younger brother was in London when the Martians fell at Woking. He was a medical student working for an imminent examination, and he heard nothing of the arrival until Saturday morning. The morning papers on Saturday contained, in addition to lengthy special articles on the planet Mars, on life in the planets, and so forth, a brief and vaguely worded telegram, all the more striking for its brevity. The Martians, alarmed by the approach of a crowd, had killed a number of people with a quick-firing gun, so the story ran. The telegram concluded with the words, "Formidable as they seem to be, the Martians have not moved from the pit into which they have fallen, and indeed seem incapable of doing so. Probably this is due to the relative strength of the Earth's gravitational energy." On that last text, the leader writers expanded very comfortingly. Of course, all the students in the Kramer's biology class to which my brother went that day were intensely interested, but there were no signs of any unusual excitement in the streets. The afternoon papers puffed scraps of news under big headlines. They had nothing to tell beyond the movement of troops about the common and the burning of the pine woods between Woking and Weybridge until 8. Then the St. James's Gazette, in an extra special edition, announced the bare fact of the interruption of telegraphic communication. This was thought to be due to the falling of the burning pines across the line. Nothing more of the fighting was known that night, the night of my drive to Leatherhead and back. My brother felt no anxiety about us, as he knew from the description in the papers that the cylinder was a good 2 miles from my house. He made up his mind to run down that night to me in order, as he says, to see the things before they were killed. He dispatched a telegram which never reached me about 4 o'clock and spent the evening at a music hall. In London also on Saturday night there was a thunderstorm and my brother reached Waterloo in a cab. On the platform from which the midnight train usually starts, he learnt, after some waiting, that an accident prevented trains from reaching Woking that night. The nature of the accident he could not ascertain. Indeed, the railway authorities did not clearly know at that time. There was very little excitement in the station, as the officials, failing to realise that anything further than a breakdown between Byfleet and Woking Junction had occurred, were running the theatre trains, which usually pass through Woking, round by Virginia Water or Guildford. They were busy making the necessary arrangements to alter the route of the Southampton and Portsmouth Sunday League excursions. A nocturnal newspaper reporter, mistaking my brother for the traffic manager, whom he does to a slight extent resemble, waylaid and tried to interview him. Few people except the railway officials connected the breakdown with the Martians. I have read in another account of these events that on Sunday morning all London was electrified by the news from Woking. As a matter of fact, there was nothing to justify that very extravagant phrase. Plenty of people in London did not hear of the Martians until the panic of Monday morning. Those who did took some time to realize all that the hastily worded telegrams in the Sunday papers conveyed. The majority of people in London did not read Sunday papers. The habit of personal security, moreover, is so deeply fixed in the Londoner's mind, and startling intelligence so much a matter of course in the papers, that they could read without any personal tremors. About 7 o'clock last night, the Martians came out of the cylinder and, moving about under an armour of metallic shields, have completely wrecked Woking Station, with the adjacent houses, and massacred an entire battalion of the Cardigan Regiment. No details are known. Maxims have been absolutely useless against their armour. The field guns have been disabled by them. Flying hussars have been galloping into Chertsey. The Martians appear to be moving slowly towards Chertsey or Windsor. Great anxiety prevails in West Surrey, and earthworks are being thrown up to check the advance Londonwards. That was how the Sunday Sun put it, and a clever and remarkable prompt handbook article in the Referee compared the affair to a menagerie suddenly let loose in a village. No one in London knew positively about the nature of the armoured Martians, and there was still a fixed idea that these monsters must be sluggish. Crawling, creeping, painfully, such expressions occurred in almost all the earlier reports. None of the telegrams could have been written by an eyewitness of their advance. The Sunday papers printed separate editions as further news came to hand, some even in default of it. But there was practically nothing more to tell people until late in the afternoon, when the authorities gave the press agencies the news in their possession. It was stated that the people of Walton and Weybridge and all that district were pouring along the roads Londonward, and that was all. My brother went to church in the Foundling Hospital in the morning, still in ignorance of what had happened on the previous night. There he heard allusions made to the invasion and a special prayer for peace. Coming out, he bought a referee. He came home alarmed at the news in this and went again to Waterloo Station to find out if communication were restored. The omnibuses, carriages, cyclists, and innumerable people walking in their best clothes seemed scarcely affected by the strange intelligence that the news vendors were disseminating. People were interested, or if alarmed only on account of the local residents. At the station he heard for the first time that the Windsor and Chertsey lines were now interrupted. The porters told him that several remarkable telegrams had been received in the morning from Byfleet and Chertsey stations, but that these had abruptly ceased. My brother could get very little precise detail out of them. "There's fighting going on about Weybridge," was the extent of their information. The train service was now very much disorganized. Quite a number of people who had been expecting friends from places on the southwestern network were standing about the station. One grey-headed old gentleman came and abused the Southwestern Company bitterly to my brother. "It wants showing up," he said. 1 or 2 trains came in from Richmond, Putney, and Kingston containing people who had gone out for a day's boating and found the locks closed and a feeling of panic in the air. A man in a blue and white blazer addressed my brother, full of strange tidings. "There's hosts of people driving into Kensington in traps and carts and things with boxes of valuables and all that," he said. "They came from Molesley and Weybridge and Walton, and they say there's been guns heard at Chertsey, heavy firing, and that mounted soldiers have told them to get off at once because the Martians are coming. We heard guns firing at Hampton Court Station, but we thought it was thunder. What the dickens does it all mean? The Martians can't get out of their pit, can they?" My brother could not tell them. Afterwards he found that the vague feeling of alarm had spread to the clients of the Underground Railway, and that the Sunday excursionists began to return from all the southwestern lungs, Barnes, Wimbledon, Richmond, Park, Kew, and so forth, at unnaturally early hours, but not a soul had anything but a vague hearsay to tell of. Everyone connected with the terminus seemed ill-tempered. About 5 o'clock, the gathering crowd in the station was immensely excited by the opening of the line of communication, which is almost invariably closed between the southeastern and the southwestern stations, and the passage of carriage trucks bearing huge guns and carriages crammed with soldiers. These were the guns that were brought up from Woolwich and Chatham to cover Kingston. There was an exchange of pleasantries. "You'll get eaten," "We're the best beast tamers," and so forth. A little while after that, a squad of police came into the station and began to clear the public off the platform, and my brother went out into the street again. The church bells were ringing for evensong, and a squad of Salvation Army lasses came singing down Waterloo Road. On the bridge, a number of loafers were watching a curious brown scum that came drifting down the stream in patches. The sun was just setting, and the clock tower and the Houses of Parliament rose against one of the most peaceful skies it is possible to imagine, a sky of gold, barred with long traverse stripes of reddish-purple gold. There was talk of a floating body. One of the men there, a reservist he said he was, told my brother he had seen a heliograph flickering in the west. In Wellington Street, my brother met a couple of sturdy roughs who had just rushed out of Fleet Street with still wet newspapers and staring placards. "Dreadful catastrophe," they bawled one to the other down Wellington Street. "Fighting at Weybridge. Full description. Repulse of the Martians. London said to be in danger. He had to give 3 pence for a copy of that paper. Then it was, and only then, that he realized something of the full power and terror of these monsters. He learnt that they were not merely a handful of small sluggish creatures, but they were minds swaying vast mechanical bodies, and that they could move swiftly and smite with such power that even the mightiest guns could not stand against them. They were described as vast spider-like machines nearly 100 feet high, capable of the speed of an express train and able to shoot out a beam of intense heat. Masked batteries, chiefly of field guns, had been planted in the country about Horsell Common, and especially between the Woking district and London. 5 of the machines had been seen moving towards the Tame, and one, by a freak of chance, had been destroyed. In the other cases, the shells had missed and the batteries had been once annihilated by the heat rays. Heavy losses of soldiers were mentioned, but the tone of the dispatch was optimistic. The Martians had been repulsed. They were not invulnerable. They had retreated to their triangle of cylinders again in the circle about Woking. Signallers with heliographs were pushing forward upon them from all sides. Guns were in rapid transit from Windsor, Portsmouth, Aldershot, Woolwich, even from the north, among others, long wire guns of 95 tons from Woolwich. Altogether, 116 were in position or being hastily laid, chiefly covering London. Never before in England had there been such a vast or rapid concentration of military material. Any further cylinders that fell, it was hoped, would be destroyed at once by high explosives, which were being rapidly manufactured and distributed. No doubt, ran the report, the situation was of the strangest and gravest description, but the public was exhorted to avoid and discourage panic. No doubt the Martians were strange and terrible in the extreme, but at the outside there could not be more than 20 of them against our millions. The authorities had reason to suppose from the size of the cylinders that at the outside there could not be more than 5 in each cylinder, 15 altogether, and one at least was disposed of, perhaps more. The public would be fairly warned of the approach of danger, and elaborate measures were being taken for the protection of the people in the threatened southwestern suburbs. And so, with reiterated assurances of the safety of London and the confidence of the authorities to cope with the difficulty, this quasi-proclamation closed. This was printed in enormous type, so fresh that the paper was still wet, and there had been no time to add a word of comment. It was curious, my brother said, to see how ruthlessly the other contents of the paper had been hacked and taken out to give this place. All down Wellington Street, people could be seen fluttering out the pink sheets and reading, and the Strand was suddenly noisy with the voices of an army of hawkers following these pioneers. Men came scrambling off buses to secure copies. Certainly this news excited people intensely, whatever their previous apathy. The shutters of a map shop in the Strand were being taken down, my brother said, and a man in his Sunday raiment, lemon-yellow gloves even, was visible inside the window hastily fastening maps of Surrey to the glass. Going on along the Strand to Trafalgar Square, the paper in his hand, my brother saw some of the fugitives from West Surrey. There was a man driving a cart such as greengrocers used, and his wife and 2 boys and some articles of furniture. He was driving from the direction of Westminster Bridge, and close behind him came a hay wagon with 5 or 6 respectable-looking people in it, and some boxes and bundles. The faces of these people were haggard, and their entire appearance contrasted conspicuously with the Sabbath-best appearance of the people on the omnibuses. People in fashionable clothing peeped at them out of the cabs. They stopped at the square as if undecided which way to take, and finally turned eastward along the Strand. Some way after these came a man in workday clothes, riding one of those old-fashioned tricycles with a small front wheel. He was dirty and white in the face. My brother turned down towards Victoria and met a number of such people. He had a vague idea that he might see something of me. He noticed an unusual number of police regulating the traffic. Some of the refugees were exchanging news with the people on the omnibuses. One was professing to have seen the Martians. "Boilers on stilts, I tell you, striding along like men." Most of them were excited and animated by their strange appearance. Beyond Victoria, the public houses were doing a lively trade with these arrivals. At all the street corners, groups of people were reading papers, talking excitedly, or staring at these unusual Sunday visitors. They seemed to increase as night drew on, until at last the roads, my brother said, were like the Epsom High Street on a Derby day. My brother addressed several of these fugitives and got unsatisfactory answers from most. None of them could tell him any news of Woking except one man who assured him that Woking had been entirely destroyed on the previous night. "I come from Byfleet," he said. "A man on a bicycle came through that place in the early morning and ran from door to door warning us to come away. Then came soldiers. We went out to look, and there were clouds of smoke to the south. Nothing but smoke and not a soul coming that way. Then we heard the guns in Chertsey and folks coming from Weybridge. So I've locked up my house and come on." At that time there was a strong feeling in the streets that the authorities were to blame for their incapacity to dispose of the invaders without all this inconvenience. About 8 o'clock a noise of heavy firing was distinctly audible all over the south of London. My brother could not hear it for the traffic in the main streets, but by striking through the quiet back streets to the river he was able to distinguish it quite plainly. He walked back from Westminster to his apartments near Regent's Park about 2. He was now very anxious on my account and disturbed at the evident magnitude of the trouble. His mind was inclined to run, even as mine had run on Sunday, on military details. He thought of all those silent, expectant guns, of the suddenly nomadic countryside. He tried to imagine boilers on stilts, 100 feet high. There were 1 or 2 cartloads of refugees passing along Oxford Street and several in the Marylebone Road, but so slowly was the news spreading that Regent Street and Portland Road were full of their usual Sunday night promenaders, albeit they talked in groups, and along the edge of Regent's Park there were as many silent couples walking out together under the scattered gas lamps as ever there had been. The night was warm and still and a little oppressive. The sound of guns continued intermittently, and after midnight there seemed to be sheet lightning in the south. He read and reread the paper, fearing the worst had happened to me. He was restless, and after supper prowled out again aimlessly. He returned and tried to divert his attention by his examination notes in vain. He went to bed a little after midnight, and he was awakened out of some lurid dream in the small hours of Monday by the sound of door knockers, feet running in the street, distant drumming, and a clamour of bells. Red reflections danced on the ceiling. For a moment he lay astonished, wondering whether the day had come or the world had gone mad. Then he jumped out of bed and ran to the window. His room was an attic, and as he thrust his head out, up and down the street there were a dozen echoes to the noise of his window sash, and heads in every kind of night disarray appeared. Inquiries were being shouted. "They are coming!" bawled a policeman, hammering at the door. "The Martians are coming!" and hurried to the next door. The noise of drumming and trumpeting came from the Albany Street barracks, and every church within earshot was hard at work killing sleep with a vehement disorderly tocsin. There was a noise of doors opening, and window after window in the houses opposite flashed from darkness into yellow illumination. Up the street came galloping a closed carriage, bursting abruptly into noise at the corner, rising to a clattering climax under the window, and dying away slowly in the distance. Close on the rear of this came a couple of cabs, the forerunners of a long procession of flying vehicles, going for the most part to Chalk Farm Station, where the North Western special trains were loading up, instead of coming down the gradient into Euston. For a long time my brother stared out the window in blank astonishment, watching the policemen hammering at door after door and delivering their incomprehensible message. Then the door behind him opened, and the man who lodged across the landing came in dressed only in shirt, trousers, and slippers, his braces loose about his waist, his hair disordered from his pillow. "What the devil is it?" he asked. "A fire? What a devil of a row!" They both craned their heads out the window, straining to hear what the policemen were shouting. People were coming out of the side streets and standing in groups at the corners talking. "What the devil is this all about?" said my brother's fellow lodger. My brother answered him vaguely and began to dress. running with each garment to the window in order to miss nothing of the growing excitement of the streets. And presently men selling unnaturally early papers came bawling into the street. "London is in danger of suffocation. The Kingston and Richmond defences forced. Fearful massacres in the Thames Valley." And all about him, in the rooms below, in the houses on either side and across the road, and behind in the park terraces, and in the 100 other streets of that part of Marylebone, and the Westbourne Park district, and St Pancras, and the Westward and Northward in Kilbourne, and St John's Wood and Hampstead, and Eastward in Shoreditch, and Highbury, and Haggerston, and Hoxton, and indeed through all the vastness of London from Ealing to East Ham, people were rubbing their eyes and opening windows to stare out and ask aimless questions, and dressing hastily as the first breath of the coming storm of fear blew through the streets. It was the dawn of the Great Panic. London, which had gone to bed on Sunday night stupid and inert, was awakened in the small hours of Monday morning to a vivid sense of danger. Unable from his window to learn what was happening, my brother went down and out into the street. Just as the sky between the parapets of the houses grew pink with the early dawn, the flying people on foot and in vehicles grew more numerous every moment. "Black smoke," he heard people crying, and again, "Black smoke." The contagion of such a unanimous fear was inevitable. As my brother hastened on the doorstep, he saw another news vendor approaching him and got a copy forthwith. The man was running away with the rest and selling his papers as he ran for a shilling each, a grotesque mingling of profit and panic. And from this paper my brother read that catastrophic dispatch of the Commander-in-Chief. The Martians were able to discharge enormous clouds of a black and poisonous vapour by means of rockets. They have smothered our batteries, destroyed Richmond, Kingston and Wimbledon, and are advancing slowly towards London, destroying everything on the way. It is impossible to stop them. There is no safety from the black smoke but an instant flight. That was all, but it was enough. The whole population of the great 6 million city was stirring, slipping, running. Presently it would be pouring en masse northward. "Black smoke," the voices cried. "Fire!" The bells of the neighbouring church made a jangling tumult. A cart carelessly driven smashed amidst shrieks and curses against the water trough up the street. Sickly yellow light went to and fro in the houses, and some of the passing cabs flaunted unextinguished lamps. And overhead the dawn was growing brighter, clearer, and steady and calm. He heard footsteps running to and fro in the rooms and up and down stairs behind him. His landlady came to the door loosely wrapped in dressing gown and shawl. Her husband followed. As my brother began to realize the import of all these things, he turned hastily to his own room, put all his available money, some £10 altogether, into his pockets and went out again into the streets. Chapter 15. What had happened in Surrey. It was while the curate had sat and talked so wildly to me under the hedge in the flat meadows near Halliford, and while my brother was watching the fugitives stream over Westminster Bridge, that the Martians had resumed their offensive. So far as one can ascertain from the conflicting accounts that have been put forth, the majority of them remained busied with preparations in the Horsell pit until 9 that night, hurried on some operation that disengaged huge volumes of green smoke. But 3 certainly came out about 8 o'clock, and advancing slowly and cautiously made their way through Byfleet and Pierford towards Ripley and Weybridge, and so came in sight of the expectant batteries against the setting sun. These Martians did not advance in a body, but in a line, each perhaps 1.5 miles from his nearest fellow. They communicated with each other by means of siren-like howls running up and down the scale from one note to another. It was the howling and the firing of the guns at Ripley and St George's Hill that we had heard at Upper Halliford. The Ripley gunners, unseasoned artillery volunteers who ought never to have been placed in such a position, fired one wild, premature, ineffectual volley and bolted on horse and foot through the deserted village, and the Martian walked over their guns serenely without using his heat ray, stepped gingerly among them, passed in front of them, and so came unexpectedly upon the guns in Painshill Park, which he destroyed. The St George's Hill men, however, were better led and of better mettle. Hidden by a pine wood as they were, they seemed to have been quite unexpected by the Martian nearest to them. They laid their guns as deliberately as if they had been on a parade and fired at about 1,000 yards range. The shells flashed all around the Martian, and they saw him advance a few paces, stagger, and go down. Everybody yelled together, and the guns were reloaded in frantic haste. The overthrown Martian set up a prolonged undulation, and immediately a second glittering giant answering him appeared over the trees to the south. It would seem that a leg of the tripod had been smashed by one of the shells. The whole of the second volley flew wide of the Martian on the ground, and simultaneously both his companions brought their heat ray to bear on the battery. The ammunition blew up, the pine trees all about the guns flashed into fire, and only one or two of the men who were already running over the crest of the hill escaped. After this, it would seem that the three took counsel together and halted, and the scouts who were watching them reported that they remained absolutely stationary for the next half hour. The Martian who had been overthrown crawled tediously out of his hood, a small brown figure, oddly suggestive from that distance of a speck of blight, and apparently engaged in the repair of his support. About 9 he had finished, for his cow was then seen above the trees again. It was a few minutes past 9 that night when these 3 sentinels were joined by 4 other Martians, each carrying a thick black tube. A similar tube was handed to each of the 3, and the 7 proceeded to distribute themselves at equal distances along a curved line between St. George's Hill, Weybridge, and the village of Send, southwest of Ripley. A dozen rockets sprang out of the hills before them as soon as they began to move, and warned the waiting batteries about Ditton and Esher. At the same time, 4 of their fighting machines, similarly armed with tubes, crossed the river, and 2 of them, black against the western sky, came into sight of myself and the curate as we hurried wearily and painfully along the road that runs northward out of Halliford. They moved, as it seemed to us, upon a cloud, for a milky mist covered the fields and rose to 1/3 of their height. At this sight the curate cried faintly in his throat and began running, but I knew it was no good running from a Martian, and I turned aside and crawled through the dewy nettles and brambles into a broad ditch by the side of the road. He looked back, saw what I was doing, and turned to join me. The 2 Martians halted, the nearer to us standing and facing Sunbury, the remoter being a grey indistinctness towards the evening star, away towards Staines. The occasional howling of the Martian had ceased. They took up their positions in the huge crescent about their cylinders in absolute silence. It was a crescent with 12 miles between its horns. Never since the devising of gunpowder was the beginning of a battle so still. To us and to an observer about Ripley it would have had precisely the same effect. The Martian seemed in solitary possession of the darkling night, lit only as it was by the slender moon, the stars, the afterglow of the daylight, and the ruddy glare from St. George's Hill and the woods of Payne's Hill. But facing that crescent everywhere, at Staines, Hounslow, Ditton, Esher, Ockham, behind hills and woods south of the river, and across the flat grass meadows to the north of it, wherever a cluster of trees or village houses gave sufficient cover, the guns were waiting. The signal rockets burst and rained their sparks through the night and vanished, and the spirit of those watching batteries rose to a tense expectation. The Martians had but to advance into the line of fire, and instantly those motionless black forms of men, those guns glittering so darkly in the early night, would explode into a thunderous fury of battle. No doubt the thought that was the uppermost in 1,000 of those vigilant minds, even as it was uppermost in mine, was the riddle how much they understood us. Did they grasp that we and our millions were organized, disciplined, working together? Or did they interpret our spurts of fire, the sudden stinging of our shells, our steady investment of their encampment, as we should of the furious unanimity of onslaught in a disturbed hive of bees? Did they dream they might exterminate us? At that time no one knew what food they needed. 100 such questions struggled together in my mind as I watched that vast sentinel shape, and in the back of my mind was the sense of all the huge unknown and hidden forces Londonward. Had they prepared pitfalls? Were the powder mills at Hounslow ready as a snare? Would the Londoners have the heart and courage to make a greater Moscow of their mighty province of houses? Then, after an interminable time, as it seemed to us, crouching and peering through the hedge, came a sound like a distant concussion of a gun. Another nearer, and then another, and then the Martian beside us raised his tube on high and discharged it gunwise, with a heavy report that made the ground heave. The Martian towards Staines answered him. There was no flash, no smoke, simply that loaded detonation. I was so excited by these heavy, minute guns following one another that I forgot my personal safety and my scalded hands as to clamber up into the hedge and stare towards Sunbury. As I did so, a second report followed, and a big projectile hurtled overhead towards Hounslow. I expected at least to see smoke or fire or some other evidence of its work, but all I saw was the deep blue sky above, with one solitary star and the white mist spreading wide and low beneath. And there had been no crash, no answering explosion. The silence was restored. The minute lengthened to 3. "What has happened?" said the curate standing up beside me. "Heaven knows," said I. A bat flickered by and vanished. A distant tumult of shouting began and ceased. I looked again at the Martian and saw he was now moving eastward along the river bank with a swift rolling motion. Every moment I expected the fire of some hidden battery to spring upon him, but the evening calm was unbroken. The figure of the Martian grew smaller as he receded, and presently the mist and the gathering night had swallowed him up. By a common impulse we clambered higher. Towards Sunbury was a dark appearance, as though a conical hill had suddenly come into being there, hiding our view of the further country, and then remoter across the river, over Walton, we saw another such summit. These hill-like forms grew lower and broader even as we stared. Moved by a sudden thought, I looked northward, and there I perceived a third of these black kopjes had arisen. Everything had suddenly become very still. Far away to the southeast marked the quiet. We heard the Martians hooting to one another, and then the air quivered again with the distant thud of their guns. But the earthly artillery made no reply. Now at that time we could not understand these things, but later I was to learn the meaning of these ominous kopjes that gathered in the twilight. Each of the Martians, standing in the great crescent I have described, had discharged at some unknown signal by means of a gun-like tube he carried, a huge canister over whatever hill, copse, cluster of houses, or other possible cover for guns chanced to be in front of him. Some fired only one of these, some 2, as in the case of the one we had seen. The one at Ripley is said to have discharged no fewer than 5 at that time. These canisters smashed on striking the ground. They did not explode, and incontinently disengaged an enormous volume of a heavy inky vapour, coiling and pouring upwards in a huge and ebony cumulus cloud, a gaseous hill that sank and spread itself slowly over the surrounding country, and the touch of that vapour, the inhaling of its pungent wisps, was death to all that breathes. It was heavy, this vapour, heavier than the densest smoke, so that after the first tumultuous uprise and outflow of its impact, it sank down through the air and poured over the ground in a manner rather liquid than gaseous. Abandoning the hills and streaming into the valleys and ditches and watercourses, even as I have heard the carbonic acid gas that pours from volcanic clefts is wont to do. And where it came upon water, some chemical action occurred, and the surface would be instantly covered with a powdery scum that sank slowly and made way for more. The scum was absolutely insoluble, and it is a strange thing, seeing the instant effect of the gas, that one would drink the water from which it had been strained without hurt. The vapour did not diffuse as a true gas would do. It hung together in banks, flowing sluggishly down the slope of the land and driving reluctantly before the wind, and very slowly it combined with the mist and moisture of the air and sank to the earth in the form of dust. Save that an unknown element giving a group of 4 lines in the blue of the spectrum is concerned, we are still entirely ignorant of the nature of this substance. Once the tumultuous upheaval of its dispersion was over, the black smoke clung so closely to the ground, even before its precipitation, that 50 feet up in the air, on the roofs and upper stories of the high houses and on great trees, there was a chance of escaping its poison altogether, as was proved even that night at Street Chobham and Ditton. The man who escaped at the former place tells a wonderful story of the strangeness of its coiling flow and how he looked down from the church spire and saw the houses of the village rising like ghosts out of its inky nothingness. For a day and a half he remained there, weary, starving, and sun-scorched, the earth under the blue sky and against the prospect of the distant hills a velvet black expanse, with red roofs, green trees, and later black-veiled shrubs and gates, barns, outhouses, and walls rising here and there into the sunlight. But that was at Street Cobham, where the black vapour was allowed to remain until it sank of its own accord into the ground. As a rule, the Martians, when it had served its purpose, cleared the air of it again by wading into it and directing a jet of steam upon it. That they did with the vapour banks near us, as we saw in the starlight from the window of a deserted house at Upper Halliford, whither we had returned. From there we could see the searchlights on Richmond Hill and Kingston Hill going to and fro, and about 11 the window rattled, and we heard the sound of the huge siege guns that had been put in position there. These continued intermittently for the space of a quarter of an hour, sending chance shots at the invisible Martians at Hampton and Ditton, and then the pale beams of the electric light vanished and were replaced by a bright red glow. Then the fourth cylinder fell, a bright green meteor, as I learnt afterwards in Bushy Park. Before the guns on the Richmond and Kingston line of hills began, there was a fitful cannonade far away in the southwest, due, I believe, to the guns being fired haphazard before the black vapour could overwhelm the gunners. So, setting about it as methodically as men might smoke out a wasp's nest, the Martians spread this strange stifling vapour over the Londonward country. The horns of the crescent slowly spread apart until at last they formed a line from Hanwell to Combe and Malden. All night through their destructive tubes advanced. Never once after the Martian at St. George's Hill was brought down did they give the artillery the ghost of a chance against them. Wherever there was a possibility of guns being laid for them unseen, a fresh canister of the black vapour was discharged, and where the guns were openly displayed the heat ray was brought to bear. By midnight the blazing trees along the slopes of Richmond Park and the glare of Kingston Hill threw their light upon a network of black smoke, blotting out the whole valley of the Thames and extending as far as the eye could reach. And through this 2 Martians slowly waded and turned their hissing steam jets this way and that. The Martians were sparing of the heat ray that night, either because they had but a limited supply of the material for its production, or they did not wish to destroy the country, but only to crush and overawe the opposition they had aroused. In the latter aim they certainly succeeded. Sunday night was the end of the organised opposition to their movements. After that, no body of men could stand against them, so hopeless was the enterprise. Even the crews of the torpedo boats and destroyers that had brought their quick firers up the Thames refused to stop, mutinied, and went down again. The only offensive operation men ventured upon after that night was the preparation of mines and pitfalls, and even in that men's energies were frantic and spasmodic. One has to imagine the fate of those batteries towards Esher, waiting so tensely in the twilight as well as one may. Survivors there were none. One may picture the orderly expectation, the officers alert and watchful, the gunners ready, the ammunition piled to hand, the limber gunners with their horses and wagons, the groups of civilian spectators standing as near as they were permitted, the evening stillness, the ambulances and hospital tents with the burnt and wounded from Weybridge, then the dull resonance of the shots the Martians fired, and the clumsy projectile whirling over the trees and houses and smashing amidst the neighbouring fields. One may picture, too, the sudden shifting of the attention, the swiftly spreading coils and bellyings of that blackness advancing headlong, towering heavenward, turning the twilight to a palpable darkness, a strange and horrible antagonist of vapour striding upon its victims. Men and horses near it seemed dimly running, shrieking, falling headlong, shouts of dismay, the guns suddenly abandoned, men choking and writhing on the ground, and the swift broadening out of the opaque cone of smoke. And then night and extinction. Nothing but a silent mass of impenetrable vapour hiding its dead. Before dawn the black vapour was pouring through the streets of Richmond, and the disintegrating organism of government was, with the last expiring effort, rousing the population of London to the necessity of flight.